everyone and welcome to the tutorial. Today I'm going to be demonstrating how to make 3 easy knitting projects. A pair of fingerless mitts, a set of washcloths and a big cozy shawl. These projects are wonderful gifts that you can give to anyone, even yourself if you'd prefer to keep them. All you're going to need to make the projects are yarn, knitting needles, scissors, a ruler, a tapestry needle, this is just a sewing needle with a blunt end and a large eye to fit the diameter of your yarn, some stitch markers, and if you'd like to attach tassels to the shawl, you'll need a small piece of strong cardboard that's approximately 10 centimeters or 4 inches long. The skills you'll need are casting on, working the knit stitch, working the purl stitch, binding off, and we'll take a look at increasing and decreasing, seaming, and how to make loops and tassels together. Let's start with the simplest project to knit, which is the fingerless mitts. These mitts will keep hands nice and warm in chilly weather, but also allow total freedom to type, text, or even knit because the fingers are free. Perhaps the best thing about these mitts is that though they look complicated, all they are is a knitted square that we're going to seam together to make a tube with a hole that the thumb can poke through. The number of stitches that you cast on will change the length of the mitts, and the number of rows you knit will change the circumference. For this project, I'm using 100 grams of worsted weight 100% wool yarn with 4.5mm or US size 7 needles. I'm going to use the knitted cast on method, which means I start with the slip knot and place it on my left hand needle, and that counts as my first stitch. I've also left a tail of at least 20 centimeters or 8 inches, and that's going to be used in my seaming later. Then you work a knit stitch, so insert your right hand needle into the first stitch as if to knit it, wrap your yarn around the right hand needle also as if to knit, draw the yarn and needle through the stitch to the front, and then instead of dropping the stitch from the left hand needle, we're going to place the newly created loop onto the left hand needle, so we now have 2 stitches. Cast on the next stitch by inserting the right hand needle into the stitch now closest to the left hand needle tip, wrap the yarn around the right hand needle as if to knit, then draw the yarn and needle through the stitch and again place the newly created loop onto the left hand needle. Keep doing this until you reach your desired cast on number. I'm going to cast on 31 stitches, which for my style of knitting, these exact needles and this exact yarn makes mitts that are approximately 16 centimeters or 6 1/4 inches long. If you want longer or shorter mitts, or you find that as you're knitting the mitts aren't quite coming out the length that you'd like, you can just cast on fewer or more stitches, however many you'd like. And if you want to substitute in a different cast on method of your choice, please feel free to do that as well. Okay, I've reached my desired cast on number of 31 stitches. Now these mitts are worked in garter stitch, which means that we're going to knit every stitch of every row. So let's do that. Just knit and knit and knit. If you'd like a really cozy pair of mitts, you want to make sure that the fabric you're creating is solid looking, so you can't see too many holes or gaps between the stitches. If the fabric is quite airy, try using a smaller needle size or thicker yarn, and then adjust the number of stitches you cast on so that the mitts still come out the size you desire. We'll keep knitting until the length of the work from the cast on edge to the live stitches on the needle measures the same as the desired circumference of your mitts. For my project, I'm knitting 55 rows, or until my work measures approximately 16 centimeters or 6 1/4 inches in length. My hands are about 19 centimeters or 7 1/2 inches in circumference. So making these mitts 3 centimeters / 1 1/4 inches smaller in circumference means that they fit me nice and snug. And if they stretch over time, they're still not going to end up too loose. It's entirely up to you how tight or loose you want to make your mitts, And if your mitts are to fit a different hand size, you can change the number of rows you knit to make your work the right length. To check the circumference of your mitts, you can wrap the fabric around the hand you want it to fit and just keep knitting until you're able to pinch the cast on edge and the stitches on your needle together. Then you've got the perfect size. Once your knitting reaches the desired length, we're ready to bind off. We're just going to use a traditional bind off here, which means knitting 2 stitches and then passing the further stitch from the tip of the right hand needle up and over the closest stitch to the tip and drop the stitch off the needle. Then knit another stitch and pass the further stitch from the tip of the right hand needle up and over the closest stitch. Knit another stitch, then pass the further stitch up, over and off the needle, and just keep repeating that until all you have left is 1 stitch on the right hand needle. We'll then pull the final stitch nice and big and cut the yarn so that we leave at least a 30 centimetre or approximately 12-inch length tail remaining. You may need a shorter or longer tail depending on how short or long you've made your mitts and how much seaming you'll need to do. Now cast on for your second mitt and repeat the knitting process so you can make a pair of mitts. Once you have 2 matching pieces of fabric that are the size you want, it's time to seam together the ends of each piece to turn the squares or rectangles into tubes. I'm going to start with the shorter end of yarn to seam the top of one of the mitts. So I'll grab my tapestry needle and thread it with that tail, and then line up the bind off and the cast on edges next to each other. We'll then pass the needle behind the first stitch on the opposite edge, right on the side, and pull the needle through. Then pass the needle behind the first stitch on the starting edge, again right on the side, and pull the needle through again. Going back to the other edge again, we'll pass the tapestry needle behind the next stitch along and pull the needle through. Then come back to your original edge and do the same again. What we're doing is called mattress stitch, and you'll keep seaming the edges together like this until you've made the top of the mitt the length you'd like it. Trying the mitt on, you'll want to end your stitching when it hits the webbing of the thumb and the top of the mitt covers as much of the fingers as you'd like it to. I seamed together 8 stitches on each edge of my fabric and then decided this was long enough. Then poke your needle through to the other side of your fabric where it won't be seen, and we can weave in the remaining length of tail so that our stitching doesn't come undone. An easy way to do this is by poking the needle up through a nearby garter stitch bump, then down through the next bump, and then again up through the next bump, down through the bump after that, until you've woven in a decent amount of the yarn. Then pull the needle off and trim any leftover yarn. We'll now need to seam the other end of our fabric edges together. So thread the tapestry needle with the longer tail and again match up the bind off and cast on edges. Then repeat the seaming exactly like you did before up until the stitching reaches the base of the thumb when the mitt is tried on again. I seam together 14 stitches on each edge of my fabric. If, as you're stitching, you realise you have less or more stitches on one edge of the work compared to the other, because maybe you made a little mistake here or there in your knitting which changed your stitch count, don't worry too much about it. You can ease the 2 edges together by passing your needle behind 2 stitches instead of 1 on the edge that's longer, and keep doing that as evenly as possible until the 2 edges line up again. Then, when the stitching is complete to the length we want it, we'll again poke our needle through to the other side of our work, weave in the remaining tail of yarn, and trim any excess yarn. Repeat the seaming for the second mitt. There we go, our fingerless mitts are complete. Let's now take a look at how to make a set of washcloths and how to increase and decrease to make a corner to corner square. How adorable is this little set of washcloths? They can be used in the shower, in the kitchen, wherever you like, and are a great way to experiment with shaping. I'm using DK weight 100% cotton yarn. It only takes about 25 grams of yarn to make each of these small cloths. And I'm also using 3.25mm or US size 3 needles for my project. We're going to be knitting a square from corner to corner, which means casting on a small number of stitches, increasing our stitch count gradually until we have a triangle that makes up half of our finished square, and then we'll decrease our stitch count down again to complete the square shape. We'll start again with the slip knot, and I'm leaving a tail of 25 centimeters or 10 inches so we can use the long tail cast on method this time. When I was learning to knit, I did find the long tail cast on method trickier than the knitted cast on method I showed you before, but I personally like the appearance of the long tail cast on a little more, so I think it's definitely worth practicing. If you find it too tricky, please feel free to stick with the knitted cast on method, or you can substitute in a completely different cast on method of your choice instead. If you'd like to try the long tail cast on, the slip knot gets placed on the right hand needle, and then we hold the index finger and thumb of our left hand in a C shape. We're going to dive this C between the two ends of yarn below the right hand needle so that the tail end of yarn gets draped over the thumb from the back to the front, and the end of yarn attached to the ball gets draped over the index finger from the front to the back like this. Then we'll use the remaining fingers of our left hand to clamp the ends of yarn and hold them in place. You then want to swing the tip of the right hand needle around to touch it against the fleshy part of your left hand, and then draw the needle up and into the loop of yarn that's been created around the thumb. Then swing the needle tip around behind the yarn that's passing over the left index finger to catch the yarn. Bring the needle back down through the loop around the thumb again, and then drop the loop from the thumb and gently tug both ends of yarn to snuggle up the newly created stitch on your left hand needle. Then set up the ends of yarn again so that the tail is passing over your thumb from the back to the front, and the end of yarn attached to the ball is passing over your index finger from the front to the back. Swing the tip of the right hand needle around to touch it against the fleshy part of your left hand, and then draw the needle up and into the loop of yarn that's been created around the thumb. Then swing the needle tip around behind the yarn that's passing over the left index finger to catch the yarn. Bring the needle back down through the loop around the thumb again, and then drop the loop from the thumb and gently tug both ends of yarn to snuggle up the newly created stitch. For this project, we just need 3 stitches to start, so we're now done with our cast on. In the first row, we're just going to knit these stitches to the end. Now in the next row, we're going to turn our 3 stitches into 4 stitches by working something called a knit front back increase. To do this, we pretend like we're working the knitted cast on method with the help of this first stitch, up until the point where you'd place the newly created stitch on the left hand needle. But instead, we'll keep it on the right hand needle, and then swing the needle around so we can insert it through the back of the same stitch. Then again, wrap the yarn around the needle as if to knit, draw the yarn and needle through the stitch, and now we have 2 new loops on the right hand needle. You can now slide the stitch on the left hand needle off of that needle and then knit the remaining stitches of the row normally. So you should see that you have 4 stitches. We'll add another stitch in this next row, and same increase again. We'll insert our needle as if to knit into the first stitch of the row, wrap the yarn around the right hand needle, then draw the yarn through the stitch, swing the right hand needle tip around to knit into the back of the same stitch, draw the yarn through again, and then slip the stitch off of the left hand needle so that from that 1 stitch you now have 2 stitches, and then knit the remaining stitches of the row normally. Now we have 5 stitches. We're going to continue like this, increasing by 1 stitch at the start of every row until this half of our washcloth reaches the desired size. Again, for this project, because loosely knit fabrics tend to wear out faster, you might want to aim for a solid knit fabric to make durable washcloths. Just adjust your needle size as necessary to match your yarn appropriately, and then change the number of stitches you increase to for the washcloth size you want. You can make your washcloth as big or as small as you like. For mine, I kept increasing until I had 51 stitches. Once you reach your desired stitch count, we're going to knit 2 rows without increasing. This will help to round out the pair of corners opposite to our cast on and bind off corners of the square. Okay, so now let's start decreasing to turn this triangle into a proper square. We're going to start this row by knitting the first stitch. Then we're going to skip the next stitch on the left hand needle and insert our right hand needle instead into the stitch after that. Then also insert the needle into the stitch we skipped. This joins the 2 stitches together as if they're one stitch. And then we'll wrap our yarn around the right hand needle like we do for a normal knit stitch. Draw the needle and yarn through one of the stitches on the left hand needle and then the other. Then drop both stitches from the left hand needle. So we've taken 2 stitches and turned them into one, and this is called a knit 2 together. Then we knit the remaining stitches of the row normally. For the next row, again just knit the first stitch, then insert the right hand needle through the next 2 stitches together and complete your knit stitch as normal to turn those 2 stitches into one. So just as we were increasing our stitch count by 1 every row before, we're now decreasing our stitch count by 1 every row. And we're going to continue decreasing until we have just 3 stitches remaining. Don't worry if you make a mistake along the way and maybe forget an increase or a decrease in your washcloth. The stitch counts aren't crucial. When you get down to 3 stitches, these are going to be bound off just like we bound off for our fingerless mitts. So we'll knit 2 stitches, then pass the further stitch up, over and off the needle, knit 1 stitch, pass the further stitch up, over and off the needle, and now we have just 1 stitch remaining that will pull nice and big. Cut our yarn so that it leaves about a 20 centimeter or 8 inch long tail, and make sure the end is secure. There's our beautiful washcloth. We need to secure our tails of yarn by weaving them in again, and a really easy way to do that on this project is by threading your tapestry needle with one of the tails and then running the needle down one side of the square under the bumps of the garter stitch and pulling the yarn through to hide it. Do this for the other tail too. Then cut off the remaining yarn. To make a lovely set of washcloths, you just need to make as many squares as you'd like, whether in the same or different colours, and then bundle the cloths together. Another option is to make a little loop to attach to the corner of the washcloths, which allows you to hang them up to dry. I made mine with a very similar technique to how you'd make a chain in crochet, but you don't need a crochet hook, just your hands. Start with a slip knot and make it wide enough to pass the first 3 fingers of your right hand through it. And tension the yarn attached to your ball with your left hand. Then grab that yarn with your right hand and draw it through the slip knot and tug everything gently to make your first chain. Again, you'll have ended up with a slip knot, so make it nice and big to fit your fingers through. Grab the yarn attached to the ball and draw it back through the slip knot and tug everything gently. You should see that you're starting to form a little chain of stitches below the slip knot. For the neatest possible results, try to always keep your slip knot in the same orientation as you make each chain. Continue repeating the steps until the chain reaches your desired length. I made mine by chaining 20. Then secure off the chain just as you do for the final stitch of your knitting. And sew the chain in a loop to one of the corners of your square. Then hide the remaining tails from the loop in your knitted fabric. Gorgeous work! Now let's move on to our final project, which is a big cozy shawl. This shawl is a fun knit and features both knit and purl stitches for a bit of texture. We're going to be making a triangle that's knit from the bottom up. So we start down at this corner and increase up to the flat, long edge. I've used 300 grams of a wool acrylic blend Aran weight yarn for my project and a 6.5mm or a US size 10.5 needle. I recommend that you use a circular needle for this project, which is a needle with two tips that are joined by a cable. We'll be using this needle in the exact same way as our straight needles and knitting in rows normally, but the cable allows us to accommodate a large number of stitches comfortably. The shawl starts exactly the same as our washcloth. We're going to cast on 3 stitches, and I'm using the long tail cast on method, again having left about a 25cm or 10-inch long tail. In the first row, we'll knit our 3 stitches normally. And then we're going to start increasing again at the start of every row with our knit front back increase. So turn your first stitch into 2, then knit to the end of the row. And again, turn your first stitch into 2, then knit to the end of the row. We'll keep doing that until we have 7 stitches in total. Now we're going to continue increasing the size of our triangle, but we'll switch to a different increase, which creates the decorative holes along the side of our shawl. This is called a yarn over increase. We'll first knit 3 stitches, and then to make a yarn over, we wrap our yarn once around the right hand needle as if we're working a knit stitch, but without having inserted the needle into a stitch on our left hand needle first. So just bring your yarn under the needle, then around over the top once, and leave your yarn at the back. And then knit the next stitch normally. We'll now make another yarn over by wrapping the yarn around the needle again, and then knit the last 3 stitches. So after this row, we have 9 stitches. As we've been making our triangles by increasing 1 stitch every row, and in that row we increase 2 stitches instead, it means we've already ticked off the increase for the next row, and we therefore don't need to work it. We'll just knit every stitch of this next row, including the yarn overs. In this row, we're ready to increase again. So knit the first 3 stitches, yarn over, then knit to the last 3 stitches, yarn over, and then knit those last 3 stitches. Then in the next row, just knit all the stitches to end. We're going to repeat these last 2 rows 3 times more, so that we've made 5 sets of yarn overs in total. To remind you of which row to make your yarn overs in, a useful tool is a lockable stitch marker. These look like a little safety pin that can be attached to your work. I'm going to attach one to the side I'm increasing on, which is going to be the public side of the shawl, and the other side of the shawl will be the private one that's hidden when the shawl is worn. That marker will remind me that every time I can see it, I need to work my yarn over increases. You can also use ring style stitch markers as a further reminder of where your yarn overs need to go. Place some 3 stitches in on either side of your shawl stitches as you're working across a plain knit row. In the next row, remember that if the lockable stitch marker is facing you, it's an increase row, and the ring style stitch markers are where you need to add your yarn overs. You'll increase on the inner sides of each marker. So knit to the first marker and slip it from the left to the right hand needle, then yarn over. Knit to the second marker, then yarn over, slip the marker to the right hand needle and knit the last 3 stitches. In a plain knit row, you just slip the markers when you reach them without doing anything different. When you've worked 5 sets of yarn overs, you should have 17 stitches. But don't worry too much if you've made a mistake along the way. They'll just add texture and character to your shawl. We'll work our next row normally, adding the yarn overs where we need them. And then instead of knitting all of the following row, we're just going to knit the first 3 stitches, slip your marker if you're using them, then purl every stitch until the last 3 stitches. This is going to make a stripe of stockinette stitch in our shawl. When you get to the last 3 stitches, again slip the marker if you're using them, then knit the last 3 stitches. Repeat these last 2 rows twice more so that you have 3 sets of yarn overs within your stockinette stitch stripe. Now we're going to keep repeating our garter stitch and stockinette stitch stripes, alternating between them until the shawl reaches the desired size. Every increase row is always the same, and then the following row is either knit or purled and knit, depending on if you're working a garter stitch or stockinette stitch stripe. I always worked 10 rows, so I had 5 sets of yarn overs for every garter stitch stripe in my shawl, and 6 rows, also that I had 3 sets of yarn overs for every stockinette stitch stripe. If you run out of yarn, you can add in another ball by leaving a tail of that yarn, then holding the new yarn against the remainder of the old yarn at the private side of your work. Knit the next stitch holding both yarns together, then drop the tail of the old yarn and continue knitting with the new yarn only. Later on, you can come back and weave in these tails exactly as we did for our fingerless mitts by threading them onto a tapestry needle and hiding them towards opposite sides of the shawl by inserting the needle up and down between the bumps on the private side of your work and then trimming off any excess yarn. I recommend aiming for a shawl size that means you end your knitting with a garter stitch stripe, as that will help prevent the edge of your shawl from rolling. You can also play around with the widths of your stripes, work purl stitches on your increase rows, only work the entire shawl in garter stitch instead of adding stripes of stockinette stitch, or keep using the knit front back increases throughout your shawl instead of adding the yarn overs. Whatever you like to add texture and character to your shawl. I knit 8 stockinette stitch stripes and 9 garter stitch stripes for my shawl, and in my last 2 rows I skipped the yarn over increases to round the corners of the triangle a little more. We're then ready to bind off our shawl. You want to make sure you use a nice stretchy bind off, so if you're using the traditional bind off method, just ensure you're working it really loosely. I'm going to use the Russian bind off, which is a variation of the standard bind off. In this bind off, you knit the first stitch, then slide this stitch back to the left hand needle, but keep your right hand needle inserted into the stitch. Then swing your right hand needle around so you can also insert it knitwise into the next stitch on the left hand needle. Wrap your yarn around the right hand needle as if to knit, then draw the right hand needle and yarn through both stitches and drop them off the left hand needle. Slide the stitch now on the right hand needle to the left hand needle again, keeping the right hand needle inserted. Then swing this needle tip around to insert it into the next stitch. Wrap the yarn around your right hand needle and draw the needle and yarn through both stitches, then drop them off the left hand needle. We'll repeat these steps until all we have left is one stitch remaining on the right hand needle. Then secure the final stitch and cut your yarn as normal. As a lovely final touch, you can add tassels to the corners of your shawl. This is entirely optional if you don't have enough yarn left over or prefer the shawl without them. To make my tassels, I took a small piece of cardboard and wrapped my yarn around it 30 times. Then I cut a piece of yarn about 50 centimeters or 20 inches long and tied the top of my wrapped yarn together with a tight double knot. Next, I took scissors and cut along the other end of the cardboard to split the wrapped yarn in half. And then remove the cardboard. Lastly, I cut another piece of yarn about 90 centimeters or 36 inches long, tied it around the tassel near the uncut end with another double knot, and then wrapped the yarn around the tassel about 4 times to cover the knot. I threaded the tapestry needle with this yarn and poked it up and behind the wraps, then down into the tassel to hide and secure the yarn, and trimmed the cut ends of all the yarn ends so that they were even. To secure the tassel to the shawl, I made a few stitches between the two, and tied another knot just to be safe. Then drew each end of yarn back down the tassel and trimmed them to hide. There are our 3 finished projects, ready to give to someone special or to wear and use ourselves. If you make any of these projects yourself, please share them with us by using the hashtag #TheSweaterCollective on social media. And if you enjoyed the video, please feel free to subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.